Hello and welcome back to our Road to Mythic Plus title. Last time we completed our first plus 27 keystone, and although briefly, stepped foot in a plus 28. It felt real good getting some reps in at these higher keystone levels. Fast forward to today, it's now Tuesday, so we check our vault. And the decision ends up being pretty easy. I'm still using champion track shoulders at 476 item level, so we snag the 483 shoulders to then upgrade and catalyze them into tier. I then spent some more time readjusting my outlaw UI. In the last episode, I mentioned I had added a few more weak auras, which I found quite helpful, but my screen was starting to feel a bit too crowded. So after taking some inspiration from JPC, I stripped down my old rogue UI in favor of the personal resource bar. I slapped some training dummies around and sent a fast plus 18 AD to feel things out, and I can confirm I'm feeling much better about the way things are looking. I then have Mythic raid re-clear with my guild later that evening, and the following day we log on for our first set of push keys for the week. After the last week of Fortified, my Tyrant keys are pretty low in comparison, so hopefully we can time some higher level keys and inch closer to the 3300 mark. It's episode 8, so welcome to the Road to Mythic Plus title. The affixes this week are decent. We have Volcanic and Sanguine. In my opinion, especially as a melee player, Volcanic is one of the easiest and least impactful affixes. Then Sanguine isn't great because when mobs get healed, they live longer, which adds time. But at the level of keys I'm doing, I feel like Sanguine healing makes up a very negligible part of the dungeon timer. Assuming we play it okay and avoid Sanguine healing a boss by some crazy amount. So we start with a plus 26 Atal Dazar that my friend picked up out of the vault. My current best in this dungeon on Tyrannical is a plus 23, so timing this key would be a big upgrade. And we're gonna fast forward to the last boss here. On Tyrannical, Yazma is by far the biggest pain point for most groups, and we see why pretty quick. During the first Soul Rend cast, our monk ends up going down, so we send a combat res to get them back up. Then later, I get greedy trying to fish for one more Envenom cast during my Kingsbane window, and a spider hits me, which then also takes out the Ret Paladin. Unfortunately, we don't have another combat res, and without 2 of our DPS, the Soul Rend adds make their way to the boss and we end up wiping, depleting the key. This one, definitely my fault. Doesn't feel great, but you know what, it happens, we shake it off and go again. This time we queue up my key and jump into a plus 25 rise. And we're gonna jump to the first boss, because we end up having a couple bad baits, such that when we head into the intermission, there's a noticeable chunk of the room that's covered by ground stuff. Our tank is really the only person that can run in there and soak orbs, so I ping an orb going in, hoping they'll cover this section, which they do, but a lot of orbs end up going through, and with only the paladin soaking them, they miss a few, which is enough to kill off our warlock and healer. One of the orbs did go right past me, but I didn't think I could run in the ground stuff and survive. At this key level, on Tyran, that shit hurts, and since I didn't have cloak up, I didn't want to take the risk. In hindsight, I guess I should have gone for it, because, as we've seen, the alternative is that, well, we end up wiping. Now this dungeon was recently nerfed, but this was recorded pre-nerf, and wiping here is real bad. Like it probably means we don't time the key. So GG's is called, and we instead run back the Warlock's 25 Atal Dazar. For this run, we go straight into Razan, and our tank gets absolutely blasted by the bleed. We CR them to get them back up, but then our healer gets eaten, and without a healer, I'm now concerned because of what we just saw happen to our tank. But it turns out all is well, and we just killed the boss without a healer. After which point, we clear through the packs of casters and juggernauts on the way to Priestess Alunza, where our tank dies once again. We have our second battle res come up, so we get the tank back up, but they then die again and we wipe. I think what happened here is that we didn't dispel Gilded Claws off the boss, leading to our tank getting sent to the Shadow Realm. I believe our mage could have spell stolen the buff, or I think demon hunters can take a talent that lets them dispel it, but I don't play DH, so I'm not sure about this one. In any case, nothing is done to address the mechanic, which resulted in our tank dying. So whatever, we'll just go again, except the tank then leaves. That's kinda weird. I guess they weren't too happy they had died and promptly left, but I'm fairly confident we were on pace to time the key, even with that wipe, so them leaving definitely did not sit well. But it doesn't end there. During this key, I'm hanging out in a Discord call with the Druid, the Warlock, and a bunch of other people in our guild. We find out through someone in the Discord call that after the tank left our key, they then whispered this person, asking how the mechanic works. And of course, since this person was a friend of ours in the Discord call, they then told us about it. And I mean, come on man. Could you have not asked these questions while still in the key? If you take a second to calm down, put your ego aside, and change your talents or whatever you have to do, we probably still would have had a good chance of timing the dungeon. But instead, they chose to leave and waste people's time. I don't get it. So yeah, that one did not sit well. But don't hate on this tank or be weird or anything. This applies to all my videos, by the way. At the end of the day, I respect them at least taking the initiative to get better, even if I don't agree with the exact sequence of events that occurred. And I mean, we did have a mage that could have spell stolen, so I don't mean to push all the blame for what happened on the tank, but ultimately it was the tank that left, not the mage. Moving past it, after this run, the warlock dips out and I end up sending a plus 26 fall with a few friends. As per usual, let's jump to the second boss, because we end up wiping, but this pull is significant because it's where I first learn about double ticks, and the importance of having an agreed upon dispel order ahead of time. While I've talked about both these things before, this is the final run I do prior to realizing these things. I'm caught moving during a dispel, and I'm not standing in the dark section because I'm not sure who's being dispelled first, so I die very quick. I also don't use a defensive here, but let's just pretend that part didn't happen. So we wipe, go again, and kill the boss 8 minutes later. We're turbo over the timer at this point, but a few of us wanted to experiment with some stuff, so we rip a quad dragon pull that we have like 20 deaths to. We do eventually get through it, but I mean, there's a reason you don't see people pulling like this. Afterwards, we sent a pull in the third boss, drew some funny shapes on the ground, wiped, and ended things there. Big shout out to the mage in our group, by the way. We picked them up off LFG, and after we wiped on the second boss, we said we weren't trying to time anymore, so they were free to leave if they wanted, but they stuck it out. That's pretty fucking cool. Anyways, that ends up being our final key for the night, but the following day we're back at it, and I turn to LFG to see if we can time my plus 24 Murazon's Rise. My current best in this dungeon on Tyrannical is a plus 22, so timing this would be score. For this run, we're gonna jump to a trash pull with the lizard and the 4 Maguses. This is a pretty scary pack because all 5 of these mobs have priority kicks that need to be stopped. The lizard then dashes out and I have the only kick, but I realize it too late, and since I'm the one that gets targeted, I end up dying. Once I'm dead, a Magus' volley goes off, then the lizard fixates the mage, the pally and I are the only ones with available kicks, but I'm not there and the mage dies. I make my way back and I'm sure to use my interrupt on cooldown, but our mage then dies once more to the lizard's incapacitate when our tank has the only remaining interrupts. The mage was not too happy with the lack of interrupts going out and then leaves the group. This was tilting in the moment. I mean, sure, we had a sloppy pull, but it's so early in the dungeon. What's the point of coming if you're gonna give up that quick? Anyways, this all went down real fast, so I'm still processing what happened when I then see our paladin backpedaling in place. They had DC'd, which is why we had no interrupts after I had died. In fact, with our group composition, the prop pally is like half our group's total number of kicks, and with 5 mobs that need to be stopped, not having our tank's interrupts does not bode well. So we deplete the key and I turn back to LFG to queue up the plus 23. Now that the keystone has dropped down a couple levels, I decide to run Outlaw. And starting off the key, we do a big pull with Lust into the first mini-boss. Then another big pull with the Maiden and Lizard Man. I communicate ahead of time that I'll kick the lizard. As Outlaw, you can always grappling hook over and interrupt it, so that's what I did, but I then make the mistake of kicking something else. So the lizard dashes out, I can't stop this cast, and I get wombo comboed into an orb. Without my kick, we then have a few more deaths to this pack, combined with Sanguine, and we're in combat with this pull for almost 4 minutes. We do manage to get through it, but, and this is why Rise is brutal, we then proceed to have a deathless run leading up to the final boss, where we run out of time. In the sense that we don't have enough time to complete the key, but we pull the boss anyways, except then the mage and I get assassinated by a frontal. We do have multiple combat reses, so the mage and I get back up, but we then have both orbs drop, killing off most of our group, and we call things there. Excluding the wipe to the final boss, I think us missing the timer here goes to show 2 things. Firstly, how tight the timer is, especially in its pre-nerf state, and secondly, that the mage and I were not doing a lot of damage. Rise especially is tough for me because the forced downtime makes Outlaw, and Keep It Rolling, feel pretty awkward. I haven't yet learned how to play around it, so I'm pretty sure I'm missing out on a fair amount of damage. Then when you consider that the mage in our group did less damage than I did, and we had an Aug Evoker buffing both our sorry asses, then yeah, Rise is a tough dungeon, but our damage definitely didn't help. So I queued the 22, once again as Outlaw. During the 23, I recognized that my damage was low, so I could have swapped back to Assassination here, but I mean, I'm not going to improve if I don't practice, so we reform, this time with 3 DPS, and we smash it, just missing out on the 2 chest. The Demon Hunter definitely carried here, and I'm still slacking playing the spec, but at least we got it timed. My guild then had raids, so we slammed our face into Mythic Smolderon for a while, and afterwards I hopped back into LFG to queue up my now plus 23 Darkheart Thicket. We're back to Outlaw, and this run ends up going pretty smooth. We actually have a deathless run up to the final boss, which then gets a little spicy, but the combat reses we saved up come in clutch and the boss goes down. I also managed to top overall damage as Outlaw this key, which felt pretty good. Our keystone then turns into a plus 24 Everbloom. My current best in this dungeon is a 2-chested 23, so we queue it up. And boy do we queue it up. I end up sending 5 Everblooms over the course of like 3 hours, so here are some highlights and mostly lowlights. For my plus 24, we're going to jump straight to the second boss, where our Warlock ends up going down to a cast that gets through. And without our Warlock, we don't have any range kicks, meaning the revitalized cast goes off just before Telu dies. And soon our healer goes down, followed by the rest of our group. I could have kicked the cast that killed the Warlock, but I was holding my kick for Toxic Bloom. However, the tank also had kick, so I guess the tank had the same idea. So we run it back, this time with Lust, and here I send my kick on a Warlock cast since it looked like the tank was holding theirs for Toxic Bloom. But unfortunately, when the Bloom cast goes off, the tank does not kick and we wipe to the group-wide stun. So we deplete here, but I link up with a few friends and we dive into a plus 26. Here we're going to jump into the second pull of the instance, because our tank picks up a pack of flowers, goes chain it into another pack, but then they flop. So we run it back, and as we're finishing off a 3-pack, the tank goes into another pack when... Bro, he's dead again. The tank types in party chat that he's inting and leaves. If you're like me and don't know what inting means, well, here you go. So on to the 25, this run goes pretty smooth until we get to the third boss, when during a Cinderbolt Storm set, I get vortexed by the volley and just catch the edge of some fire on the ground, which is enough to kill me. The tank has NGB res, so they're able to get me back up, but then our evoker dies to fire and our monk turns into a popsicle. So we wipe, and with 2 bosses and some trash remaining, we don't have enough time and GG's is called. We then run back to 24, and this time we have a deathless run up until the second boss, but during the fight we slowly rot out. It definitely felt like the healer was struggling to keep up, and when we pull for a second time, it's more of the same. We wipe once more and that's key. But the 5 of us decide to run back to 23, once again having a deathless run up until the second boss, and we again rot out during this fight, but we're able to kill Telu, B-res the evoker, and finish the encounter. Moving on to the trash before the third boss, while dealing with a Pyromancer, we accidentally butt pull the Arcanomancer pack in, and on the following Cinderbolt volley, our evoker ends up going down, and then our hunter gets Pyroblasted. But we get through it and proceed to stomp through the rest of the instance, finally getting a time on the board. I then join a plus 25 Waycrest, and this run goes pretty smooth up until the second boss. Our hunter dies in a Soul Thorns, we B-res them back up, but then later, while our Warlock has Soul Thorns, the tank runs into the fire, resetting the boss stacks, and unfortunately, that's a little too much damage for the Warlock to handle. Our healer then gets meleeed to death, and our hunter dies to a Soul Thorns immediately after. So we end up wiping here, and since we don't have Lust, we instead try to clear the trash up to Ral. But, and in typical Waycrest fashion, we somehow pull the mobs up the stairs. Oh, we pull upstairs. Dude, how do we always pull that? Resulting in a full wipe. So we run it back and engage Ral. Our timer does not look great at this point, but who knows, maybe miracles are possible. Also on a side note, Assassination feels real bad for this boss, especially now that I've played Outlaw in here a couple times. As Outlaw, you have extendo hands so you can hit this guy from miles away, and Blade Flurry goes crazy on the ads. Assassination, for comparison, has short little dinosaur hands, making it super difficult to maintain uptime without standing in the green goo. and Caustic Spatter has a pretty short range that's based on the boss's location, so I don't have great cleave damage for this fight unless the ads get real close to the boss. Which they eventually do, but we don't kill them fast enough and the boss eats a couple servants, which is enough to wipe us. So that's key, but we're back the next day, sending a quick plus 22 warm-up key into a plus 22 fall, where we'll jump to the second boss, because I think I've officially become a manifested time-waste expert, as I can now immediately understand every death on this fight. Here our Warlock dies because they move right as the debuff expires, we B-res them back up, but later they run into a ball, and then our Hunter rots out to the dot. The healer should have dispelled the Hunter first since they're a lot more squishy, but that doesn't end up happening, so I then proceed to training dummy this boss for the next 3 minutes. But the rest of the run goes real smooth, and we 2-chest the key, getting us 6 Mythic plus score. At this point, I decided to try and push my key up. It was formerly a plus 23 Everbloom, but I re-rolled it after the last dungeon into a Darkheart Thicket. And we have a super clean run, upgrading our keystone to a plus 24 Blackrook Hold. For this run, we have some issues during the scavenger pulls. With Sanguine, these ads tend to live for quite a while, meaning they're more likely to drink their juice and start wreaking havoc. But once we get through the section, the rest of the dungeon goes off without much issue, and we finish the key with plenty of time to spare. And guess what? My keystone upgrades to a plus 25 Everbloom, so back in we go. And on the first pull, our tank goes down, so we're going to chain die to this pull a good few times. And on the next pull, our tank's gonna go down once again, this time resulting in a full wipe. And I'll spare you the details, but we pull Yalnu with 23 deaths and 1 minute remaining, which is not quite enough time to kill the boss. But it doesn't matter because we end up wiping and calling the key. So we run back to 24, and this run goes pretty smooth, at least up until the trash before the second boss, where we do a massive double A-bomb pull that proves to be a little too much for our group. But after this point, the rest of the dungeon goes smooth enough and we time the key, granting us a huge 2 Mythic Plus rating, rolling my keystone into a plus 25 Murazon's Rise. I'm not too thrilled about running that dungeon, so I instead turn to LFG and queue into a plus 25 Waycrest Manor. And we're playing Outlaw for this dungeon. Now, if you're somebody more familiar with the spec, you'll notice I'm not doing the sort of pre-dungeon things you're supposed to do. Namely, using Blade Flurry, Adrenaline Rush, Slice, and keep it rolling before putting the key in. I do eventually learn this pre-dungeon routine, but for now, and to translate what that means for somebody that doesn't play Outlaw Rogue, I lose a bit of damage and a few globals in my opener. So, in the grand scheme of an entire key, it's not the worst thing in the world. Now, if you've been paying attention to what specs have been playing during this week of Mythic Plus, you may have noticed I'm not playing much Assassination, which is, and has been my main rogue spec up to this point. So why is that? Well, part of the reason is something I've discussed before, which is that after the Asa Rogue nerfs, the spec sort of lost out on its spot in the meta for Mythic Plus. I mean, as I've shown, you can still play it, but when there are other, better DPS classes that exist, and when I say better here, I'm referring to what DPS specializations are being played most often at the highest keystone levels, it becomes increasingly difficult getting into groups. And I'll elaborate more on this in a later episode, but as we're approaching these higher keystone levels, the ceiling for the spec becomes more apparent. There are a couple things I could point out here, but the most obvious difference is comparing the survivability of Sin with Outlaw. I'm gonna pull a number out of thin air here, but Outlaw has something like 20% more DR than Assassination Rogue, and especially on Tyran weeks, that additional survivability can sometimes make or break a key. Then finally, with the Sanguine affix, Assassination feels kind of hopeless in comparison to both the other rogue specs. For starters, you no longer want to use Crippling Poison. Okay, so you take it off, but then you lose some value from one of your talents because you're not utilizing a second non-lethal poison. Okay, well, we can play a different build and pick up some different talents, but this is a more AoE-centric build, and it's Tyran week, so we don't love this change because it would mean compromising our single target damage. Additionally, Outlaw and Sub have no issues running Wound Poison, reducing the healing done by Sanguine, which is very strong. They can even talent into improved Wound Poison with relative ease if they so choose. Sin, on the other hand, is a spec that deals damage with their poisons. So if you play the AoE build we talked about, you can't run wound poison because you need to have deadly poison. So then you have to play Dragon Tempered Blades with wound poison and without crippling poison, meaning you lose amplifying poison and a sizable chunk of your damage. Now I don't know how the numbers work out, but I think you lose more damage trying to play wound poison than the healing reduction from wound poison would benefit your group. So if the question is whether or not you do damage or play wound poison, why play assassination at all when the other two rogue specs can do both? Anyways, that's a bit of a rant, but going back to the dungeon, we make our way to the first boss when I forget to move while fighting Malady and rot out to the dot. My fault, I get B-resed, and right as I take the res, the healer gets jagged nettles and dies. We can't finish this fight down a healer, so we wipe and run it back. This time, I'm sure to keep moving, but our healer goes down and now we don't have a B-res, meaning we wipe once more, and that's key. Afterwards, I jump into a +24 throne, where during the first boss, after being targeted by Shock Blast, our healer stands in a swirly and dies. All good, we can just combat res them back up, except in our party, nobody has a B-res. So we're forced to wipe and run it back, which is rough. The run back to the first boss is not short. However, we smash through the rest of the dungeon and just manage to beat the timer. This gets us a small gain of 3 Mythic Plus score, and at this point, I've built up the confidence to attempt my +25 Murazon's Rise. And, reminiscent of a previous run, we're going to jump to the first boss. Being the only melee player, I'm trying to stay on the boss and soak any nearby orbs. Ideally, the tank drags the boss nearer to the pillar, so I can more easily cover a wider cone. But this doesn't happen, so I run around collecting orbs near the boss, and unfortunately, we let 3 orbs get through, which is enough to kill our healer. Our pally is able to B-res them back up, but unfortunately, I go down with the debuff. In hindsight, I should have prioritized my survival once the healer went down. I still had health pot and a couple defensives I could have used before I died. And with only 4 players alive, this boss is not friendly. Eventually, our evoker goes down, followed by the rest of our group, and that's key. So we reform and tackle the now +24. And thankfully this time, we make it past the first boss and into the sand section. And as a rogue here, or probably any DPS class for that matter, it's super easy to pull threat on the mobs here. With new adds continually running in, it can be tricky for a tank to maintain threat on everything. So unfortunately, my Blade Flurry does not turn off and I get mowed down. To be fair, I had both tricks and evasion up, so I had some options available that could have prevented my death, but I was too slow to react. Afterwards, we dunked on Chromie and made our way to Battlefield, where the second death then comes to the tank's mortar. The priest gets targeted, backs themselves into a corner, and goes down. However, that death ends up being the final one for the dungeon, as we breeze through Deos, timing the key 3 minutes 47 seconds under, netting ourselves +6 score and upgrading my keystone to a +25 fall. So we jump in, and you guessed it, we're going to the second boss. But I'm prepared. Before we engage Manifested Timeways, I instruct the healer to dispel me last, which is somewhat misleading, because I'm not actually getting dispelled, but we'll get to that later. Because I'm playing Outlaw with elusiveness, I'm very tanky. So because the Chronofaded debuff applies a dot, it makes sense for me to be the person that holds the debuff the longest. And I'm confident I can position myself correctly such that I'm in the dark section when the first spell goes off, and the light section when my debuff expires. Also, this is what I meant when I said I'm not really getting dispelled second. I'm actually not getting dispelled at all, and I'm instead letting my debuff expire. But asking to be the second dispel sort of conveys the same meaning. And by communicating this, everyone in our group knows that if I have a debuff, the other person with the debuff should move to the light section and prepare for a dispel. Removing some of the ambiguity regarding who's being dispelled makes this fight a lot easier. Except it doesn't help much when I don't get the debuff. And on the first set of debuffs, the priest and the hunter both get it. They both stand in the light section, and when the priest dispels themselves, the hunter goes down, which then also kills our evoker. So we reset and run it back. I have cloak for the first set of debuffs, where luckily I get picked. I then get picked again on the following set of debuffs, and this set goes to show both how tanky Outlaw is, and how to position as someone whose debuff is being left to expire. Unfortunately, on the following set of debuffs, the priest dispels themselves in the dark section. I have Shadow Step so I can easily get across, but I'm worried about the rest of my team. And in particular, my eyes are fixated on the Thunder Fury wielding Evoker, pacing back and forth at the edge of the arena. And just as they're forced out of my line of sight, I get run over by a ball. I was so focused seeing whether our Evoker would make it across that I was not paying attention to the orbs, which I felt real bad about, because our Evoker was able to make it over, so the only death was me taking an orb to the face. Then on the following set of debuffs, the priest dispels themselves in the light section this time, but the Evoker is sitting on a sliver of health and dies with a debuff, which then also kills the hunter. And unfortunately, that is GG. I guess the moral of the story here is to check yourself before checking others. That ends up being my final key for the day, and so far, it's been a rough week. We've depleted a lot more keys than we've timed, and I'm partly to blame in several of these runs. This is the first week I've seriously branched away from assassination, and I can feel it. I'm making a lot of mistakes. But you know what? There's bound to be ups and downs. I never expected getting Mythic Plus title would be all sunshine and rainbows, and I think this episode definitely shows that. But we'll be back next time to go through the remaining Tyrant keys for the week and try to break 3300 Mythic Plus score. If you've enjoyed, be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for watching.